Yesterday we practiced converting fractions, mixed numbers into decimals. Today we're going to go the opposite direction. We're going to look at converting decimals to mixed numbers. So in order to help you to really understand how these numbers have the same values, whether they're fractions or decimals, I wanted to show you a picture. You've seen these models, these 10 by 10 grids, for several years now. You've worked with them in elementary school. And so as a refresher, if I asked you to write a fraction that matched this, if we look at this very first 10 by 10 grid, we see that the whole thing is shaded in. So that means that's one whole. When I look at this second one here, I know that there's 100 squares that are inside that 10 by 10 grid. And if I was to count them, there's 10, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 25 out of 100 of that second grid are shaded in. So now if I was to want to write this fraction as a decimal, I know I have $1 and then I have about 25 cents because this is like 100 pennies and we have 25 of them. Our decimal is great, but look at our fraction. Our fraction is partially correct, but it's not in simplest form. So what I have to do is I have to simplify this fraction so that way it is in simplest form. As we are working our way through these problems, you will always want to make sure that they are in simplest form. It's kind of a rule in math that you always make sure that those fractions are simplified. So when I look at 25 and 100, I know that they can both be divided by 25. So when I simplify, I still have my whole. 25 divided by 25 is 1, and 100 divided by 25 is 4. So 1 1/4 and 1.25 are the ones that are equal. They are equivalent. So now let's look at examples like this, where we have some fractions that are already given to us. They're not ones that we have to write out. Some decimals that are given to us. And what we need to do is we need to now go in and we need to write them as a fraction. So our whole number is going to stay the same. It's 1. So I'm going to put my 1 here. A little trick that I teach my students is this. If you're not sure what to put behind this decimal, you take this decimal and you write a 1, you write a 0 for each digit after the decimal point. So a 0 for the 7, a 0 for the 5, and then there's your numerator and your denominator. 75 in my numerator, 100 in my denominator. Now, if you remember how to read decimals correctly, it makes your writing of fractions much easier. So you would read this decimal as 1 75/100, which is exactly how you write your fraction, 1 75/100. But again, we have to simplify. We need to make sure that we have this fraction in simplest form. Simplifying is not negotiable. It is always required when you are working with fractions that your final answer is in simplest form. 25 and 100 I know can be divided by 25. So that means that my whole number stays the same. 75 divided by 25 is 3. 100 divided by 25 is 4. So my correct answer is 1 3/4. When I come and look at this one, it's the same. 3 1600 would be the correct way. Or I can put a 1 under the decimal and a 0 for each digit after. And I end up with 3 1600. Now, I have to think about what 16 and 100 can both be divided by. I know this fraction's not in simplest form. So I'm going to divide both of these by 4. Because 16 and 100 can both be divided by 4. Whole number stays the same. 16 divided by 4 is 4, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. All right, here I want you to go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to give these problems a try. See what you come up with, and then come back and check your work. But you need to pause your video first, please. All right, so here are the answers to these three problems. 4 and 7/10 is 4 and 7/10. 9 and 2/100 can be simplified to 9 and 1/50. And 1 and 25/100 simplifies to 1 and 1/4. I wanted to go ahead and work this next one out with you. So I'm going to put first of all, when we read this, it's 3 and 620 thousandths, or we could leave this 0 off and it's 3 and 62 hundredths, or we can put that 1 under that decimal, a 0 for each digit after, so the 6 gets a 0, the 2 gets a 0, and the 0 gets a 0. And then we end up with 3 and 620 over 1,000. And from here, we need to simplify. Maybe you're not quite sure what any of this can simplify to, but you know that they end in a 0. So we can divide both sides by 10. That's a good way to start. So 620 divided by 10 is 62, and 1,000 divided by 10 is 100. I know these both can be simplified still because they're both even. So let me try by 2 this time. 62 divided by 2 is 31, and 100 divided by 2 is 50. Yeah, so there we go. So my whole number 3 stays the same, and then I have 31 over 50. If it takes you a couple of jumps to simplify, that's okay. Don't let that bother you. But remember, today, all of your work, all of your fractions have to be in simplest form.